Hello everyone. My computer and my other clocks disagree again, so it's interesting. We're about 2 minutes apart on either. I'm not sure why that is. Okay. I'm going to try, while we wait for everyone to join. Ooh. So we've got Andrew T and Melbourne Regional Train Vlogs. G'day everyone. Leisure, yes. So that's interesting. All right. Everything's going all right for me. Move that out the way. So, since we've got 4 people, let's get started. Today's topic is long distance rail. We're going to be discussing everything to do with long distance rail. We're going to start off by talking a bit about how I define long distance rail, what different examples are like throughout Australia, and maybe a couple of things from the international world, but I'm not super familiar with international examples, so we'll see to what extent that happens. But yeah, I'm going to be talking about what I think the place of long distance rail is, how it competes with flying primarily, or road, because yeah, obviously those are the 2 main competitors there. Yeah. So, firstly, how do I define long distance rail? I'd define it as anything more than 2-ish hours. So, sort of on the 3-hour or beyond total journey time. So yes, examples that have already been mentioned in the comments, such as XPT, DeGan, Indian Pacific, Overland, Great Southern, and the Southern Spirit, short-lived Southern Spirit. Yes, they are all Australian examples of long-distance trains. Eurostar, yes, that's an international example. But long-distance rail serves a very different purpose to short and medium distance rail. What do I mean by short and medium distance? G'day, Albert. Short distance I'd define as anything suburban. And yes, that's going to vary depending on where you live. Just briefly, the main purpose of short distance rail is moving a lot of people. It has to be relatively competitive with road, but as long as it's roughly the same amount of time, it's not drastically longer, the purpose remains the same. And so that's where metro rails come into play. And they're generally not so much designed for comfort. There'll be a little bit of comfort, but comfort isn't their number one priority. Now, medium distance rail, that is most of your V-line services if you're from Victoria. So anything in the sort of 1 to 2 hour-ish range counts in my eyes as medium distance. And thinking of V-Line, really they operate all three, short, medium and long. Although in V-Line speak, short distance is defined as Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, Seymour type thing, but I'm calling that medium distance, just so we get definitions out of the way. What purpose does medium distance hold? Well, again, it's about moving people. It has to be a bit more competitive with road. People would like it to be at least as fast as road, if possible a little bit faster than road. That's not really possible with suburban trips because of the frequency of stopping. The train simply can't get up to a high enough top speed before it needs to slow down again for stations. But in medium distance, of course, there's a lot greater distance between stations, and so you can get trains that, at least in Victoria, typically run up to 160 kilometres an hour. And I think that that's fairly typical throughout the world for that sort of distance, 160 k's an hour. Yes, there's going to be some slightly faster, maybe up to 200, but not that much faster. You're not going bullet train fast on a medium distance service. But yeah, medium is still about moving people primarily. There'll be a little bit more focus on comfort, but it's still not the number one priority. I'd say it's number 2 priority, is comfort. And then, yeah, it's not fitting as many people, but I guess the main purpose of it is to connect cities. So you'll sometimes hear it called intercity rail. And so, yeah, it'll still be mainly filled with commuters in the morning and evening peaks. But yeah, it also supports a little bit of tourism as well. So finally, long distance, of course, is anything beyond that. In the V-Line world, you're looking at Warrnambool, Swan Hill, Bairnsdale, even sort of Ararat, Maryborough, Echuca. You know, those are some relatively close examples. Most rail services are typically mostly about moving people. There are the occasional luxury train, which also fits within the long distance category. But for the most part, comfort is a big priority because the journey times are a lot longer. Of course, you'll get varying degrees of comfort, and V-Line is notorious for using the slightly less comfortable carriages on the slightly longer trips. But yeah, that's a discussion for another time. Point is, the main people who are using it aren't so much commuters. It'll be people who are tourists or are visiting friends or family in either direction, or they'll be visiting somewhere, they'll be commuting but not for work, more so for medical appointments and that sort of thing. Anything where their small town that they live, that the rail connects to, that is where, if their small town doesn't have the services that they need, it'll connect them to larger cities, and it will often pass through the route of the medium distance. And a quick note, I think I called medium distance intercity. I think long distance is more often called intercity, and medium distance is more often referred to as interurban. Anyway, we're not using intercity, interurban in this video. We're just going with medium, short, medium, long. So, reading a few comments. How's Fogarty Avenue going? Pretty good. You can ask Les. Contrary to popular belief, Les and I are still friends. He came to pick something up from me today. Long distance have more needs catered for, says Robert, for sleeping, eating, etc. But in Australia, most of our long distance rail is less transport, more tourism. Yes. And further on in the live stream, I will get into more details as to the different lengths of long distance rail and when it gets to at the point where you have to go overnight. Yeah. Yes, Mikey's supported destinations is roughly what I'm defining as medium distance. Robert says they can't safely go above 175. I'm not sure what you're talking about there. Melbourne Regional Train Vlogs has given a few examples of long distance rail, as has Andrew T. Robert says Victoria's rail infrastructure is heavily underdeveloped. Yes, I would agree to you as a general statement, but there's more detail to that. I need high-speed rail, says Melbourne Regional Train Vlogs. I'm just going to call you MRTV from now on. Like France, Germany, and Japan. I will be discussing that later in the stream. Intercity, interurban vary in definition, says Albert, as they are used more as marketing terms. Yes, you're absolutely right. Short, medium, and long distance are better to establish definitions, hence why I'm using them. Should bring the outer city loop back, that would be awesome. Yeah, I can discuss in another live stream lost lines of Melbourne and stuff like that, and what, why they were lost and what things they might be useful for. Just say it as it MAR TV. Okay, fine. Robert says, put it this way, why the trains are constantly packed on lines like Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo, planned to have metropolitan trains put into the edge of what's classed as metro areas. Yes. Yes. V-Line have a tendency to be allocated a few short distance routes that should really be allocated to metro, and so you're using the medium distance trains to do the short distance runs and the medium distance runs on the same service, and so there's a conflict of interest there, and the suburban commuters win out basically, and the medium distance commuters aren't too happy about it. But that's the problem with V-Line. Well, it's not V-Line's fault really, it's the PTV's fault and whoever else, government, whatever. So, now that definitions are all out of the way, let's look at some specific examples within Victoria to start with, and then I'll move out further to Australia. So in Victoria, we do have a few short, medium distance, I should say, trains that are on long distance routes, and so they do lack catering facilities, which is was mentioned earlier. That is something that is generally expected to be found on a long distance service, because again, the journey time is longer, and so you know, if you're on there for the full trip, then, or even part of it, you get a bit peckish. It's not a complete disaster because, of course, you can bring your own food on, and it's not like it's a 12-hour journey or anything like that. It's just to the point where you're uncomfortable. And so, yeah, but even so, V-Line are planning to make long distance, a new generation of long distance trains. They're calling them long distance velocities. How similar they are to the current velocity fleet, we're yet to really find out. But yeah. Yes, and another thing with, now that Robert's mentioning if you pick up short distance passengers, there's a lot more people there, and so the trains get packed out more easily. The long distance trains tend to stop at very few short and medium stops. They will stop at a few, and that's generally only to pick up and drop off passengers. You're not really supposed to get on a Swan Hill service, for example, and go from Footscray to Sunshine. You can do it if you really want to, but you're not really supposed to. Yeah, Andrew mentions 9-car velocity testing. Yeah, that's really a result of short and medium distance merging a lot with V-Line. So they need the extra capacity. Another feature that you'll often find in long distance trains is multiple classes. Typically in Australia, you see only 2 different classes, economy and first. But I'm trying to think. I'm not sure if Queensland ever had a 3rd class carriages, or maybe Commonwealth did. Certainly Victoria never had 3rd class. I don't think New South Wales did, or Western Australia, or the normal South Australian railways, but yeah. 3rd class you do see occasionally overseas, but yeah, it's not a big thing in Australia, probably because there's just not the need for it. Yeah, in Victoria, 1st class gets you reclinable seats and a bit more legroom, and a bit more width if it's available, if 1st class is available. So I've sat in 1st class. I've never actually paid for a 1st class V-Line fare. I got to ride 1st class when it was free, back a couple of years ago. I remember booking the train over the phone, and the person on the phone said, "Oh, so did you want first or economy?" I said, "What sort of question is that? It's free. I want first." So I got first, and that was nice. With V-Line, it's usually a $20 upgrade. I generally find that's not worth it personally. The extra comfort isn't that much of a difference for me, but there are plenty of people who think that the upgrade is worth it, and first class is almost always booked out on V-Line trains. So I wonder, with their new generation of trains, with a new generation of long distance trains, will they include first class or not? We'll have to wait and see. They definitely will include a buffet, but yeah. In Victoria, we tend not to have any overnight trains unless you count the XPT. But yeah, and we used to have a few overnighters. The most famous ones was, of course, the Southern Aurora and the Overland, but we also had the Vinelander. So Vinelander was to Mildura, Overland to Adelaide, Southern Aurora to Sydney. Now the Overland is still running, hooray, but it is not an overnight service. It's only a daytime service. XPT has replaced the Southern Aurora and is running a daytime and a nighttime service. And I guess, although it's not officially first, second, third class on the XPT, you almost could call it a tri-class train, even in the daylight services, because they've got the XAM carriages, which are the compartment sleeping carriages. So you've got first and second day sitting, and then they call it first class bed services. So I'm going to call that a tri-class train. It's almost the only, I come to think of it, I'm trying to think of if there's any other examples of effectively three-class trains in Australia still existing, and I don't think so. I guess there's a couple of trains in Queensland which weren't technically tri-class, but could have at one point be classed as even be defined as quad class, because they had first and second seats, day sitting, and first and second class sleepers. So I don't know, make of that what you wish. Yes, MarTV mentioned Steamrail and 707 Weekenders go overnight. And yes, I guess you could count them as long distance rail, but I'm generally not thinking of them because those are special services that aren't run to a regular timetable. I'm talking mainly about the timetabled services. Yes, you're very right, Albert. Indian Pacific was until recently tri-class. I'm not sure about quad class, but it was definitely tri-class until a few years ago, because they had economy seating, economy sleeper, and first sleeper. So there's 3 for you. It's all about demand, says Robert. A lot of people would rather pay the premium to just fly or drive themselves. The novelty isn't really there anymore for a lot of people. Yes, and I think that brings us nicely into my next point, which is the competition. So, as mentioned there, the 2 big competitions for long distance rail, and this is where competition in rail really matters, in passenger rail at least, is road and flying. The advantages to going by road, well, it's door to door. So you don't have to change trains anywhere. It's your own private vehicle. It's often cheaper if you are with multiple people. So if you're a family going from Melbourne to Sydney, for example, it's a lot cheaper to drive than to pay for your whole family to go on the train or fly. Comparing just flying and rail, flying is often cheaper than rail. It used to be the case that rail was the cheaper option, but these days with the rise of budget airlines, you can often get a flight to Sydney for like $50 one way, or $100 return for one person. And if you went the same by rail, it'd cost you maybe $120 return, $60 one way. And so that's something to think about, especially with, of course, the biggest advantage that flying has over rail, which is speed. While with driving, and another benefit is that, of course, you've got your car when you get to the destination, so you don't have to hire a car if that's something that you do. You've got the complete freedom and flexibility of the car. But yeah, with flying, you obviously still have to change services effectively. You've got to get to the airport, change the flight, land, change again. So, there's that. And you've also, just worth a mention, when you're looking at flying, you've got to take into account the time it takes you to get to and from the airport, including any sort of, you want to get to the airport an hour early, for example. You've got to include that if you're trying to compare the times of flying versus going on the train. And for that matter, compare getting to and from the station on the train as well, but that's generally a lot quicker than the airport. And it's just the flight itself, the main journey part, that's a lot quicker in planes. So in terms of rail being a novelty, yes, that is, rail tourism is a thing. There are a set demographic who aren't necessarily railway enthusiasts, although often are, who will take the train because they just like trains. But yeah, flying can get a bit interesting when you're looking at not major cities, but say Mildura or Swan Hill to Melbourne. It's far enough away so that there's some people who will need, perhaps older people, who need to get to appointments and that sort of thing. They don't want to drive, or they can't drive, and flying between a small place, either two small places or a small place and a big place, as long as one of the destination, as long as the origin or destination is a small location, flying is often very expensive. I think when I was looking up flights, because when I was doing Queensland, I was looking at how did I want to get back from Charleville, because the train, I would have taken the train as if it was available, but it wasn't available for when I wanted to go back. So I was looking at, okay, do I fly? And from memory, the tickets were about like $250 one way. So it was just out of my budget to fly. And look, I'm actually a bit of an aviation enthusiast as well. So I certainly don't have anything against flying. But as it turned out for me, road was cheaper. Which reminds me, road isn't necessarily your own car. It can be a long distance coach. Coaches tend to be about the same price as a train, from my experience, at least in Australia. But their big advantage over trains is that they often run more frequently. And so the service is often, the road coach is often available when the train that you want to catch is not. So, yeah, and the road coach will often stop at more places along the way. It's much easier for a road coach to stop. It doesn't require station infrastructure or anything like that. But, yeah. MarTV says, going overnight by road is boring. Yes, but so is the train, to be completely honest, unless you're really into that train. So, yeah. Going overnight by anything is boring unless you're really into that thing, basically. Speaking of overnight services, that's when rail does have a big advantage over road in some situations, which is you can often pay for a bed. There are some coaches around the world, I'm not sure any exist in Australia, where they do offer a bed service, but yeah, they're certainly not very common, and you will often get much better facilities on the overnight train anyway, such as you'll often be provided a half-decent meal, or at least be able to purchase a half-decent meal. The train runs through the night, as does the bus as well, but it's just generally, I mean, the cabin, you get a whole cabin if you're getting a bed. So the facilities are basically a lot nicer on overnight rail than they are on overnight coaches, even the ones with beds on them. Albert says the Indian Pacific has a super luxury platinum class 2. Yes, very right. I forgot about that. I'm not sure if it runs every service or if it's just some services, but yes, I had forgotten that you can basically hire out, charter your own private carriage. But yeah. MarTV says, I would say that the GAN is the luxurious train in Australia because it's got very spacious rooms and very comfortable beds and very delicious food. Most luxurious. Okay. Yes and no. I'll get onto that a little bit later. Elle says, like the Firefly coach to Adelaide. Yep. There's a few different long-distance coach operators. Firefly is one. I think Outback Queensland or something is one that operates in Queensland. Greyhound is another big one. There's a few. When COVID-19 is over, I'm going to ride the Overland. Good plan. I would like to ride it again. I rode it once, but my camera ran out of batteries because I left them all in my place in Adelaide. I got it all back, but by the time I got them back, I'd lost my camera, so I'll have to redo the overland sometime and actually film it and make a video. Robert says, I've never flown anywhere, but relatives have, and the food they brought on the airplane was absolute dog shit. Yes. You certainly don't fly for the food. Unless you want to pay big bucks, but yeah. Yeah, so I guess I'll talk about a few specific trains now from Australia that I've personally been on, both overnight and during the day, and talk about what they did right, what they did wrong, and how they might be able to be, how I think they should be an influence, positive or negative, to the rest of Australia, and how it compares to the potential of some of the services that I know of, I know a bit about, but haven't necessarily been on, such as the GAN, Indian Pacific, etc. So the state that I think does long-distance rail the best, by far, is Queensland. They don't run many long-distance trains, but when they do, they are for very long distances. I think the Westlander is something like 800 kilometres, so, you know, equivalent of Melbourne to Sydney. Spirit of Queensland, which is in the thumbnail, is something like 11 or 1200 kilometres, huge distances. Spirit of the Outback, which is the longest by time in Queensland, is 26 hours and I think a bit over 1,000 Ks. And of course, we've got the Inlander as well. Just for reference, the electric tilt train, I'm counting that as a medium distance service, not a long distance service. Although, well, it depends. Okay, no, it is a long distance service, but it's not on the same level as the rest. It's more on the level of Victoria's long distance trains. Medium distance in Queensland, I would count as the Intercity Express trains to Gympie North. I haven't actually travelled on them. I would definitely like to the next time I'm in Queensland, or allowed to be in Queensland, should I say, as a Victorian at this current time. The Westlander and the Inlander are two very similar services. They're both overnight. They don't necessarily, they're of that sort of in-between length where you could either do it overnight as they do, or you could do it as a daytime service. I think it suits it better to be an overnight service. And big props to Queensland for supporting the train, even though I think there was a maximum of like 6 passengers when I travelled on it. And the subsidy per passenger is something like $1,000 at least. So, what about the diesel tilt train to Cairns? I'll get onto that in a minute. Now, the Westlander in its current form, as in anything that I say about the Westlander, also applies to the Inlander. In this instance, it is 2 sitting carriages plus a half lounge, half staff car, and it's compulsory overnight. There is no daytime service. And you get provided a snack pack, shall we say, for each of your meals. So it's not, the food isn't bad. It's certainly not airline food, but it's nothing fancy. You get a sandwich and a juice box, some fruit, and like a chocolate bar or something like that. What do I think they do well? For the very limited number of passengers, I think that, and they're keeping the train going to serve the community. I think that's good. I probably wouldn't blame them if they cut it out in a few years' time. And if you know the Westlander and the Inlander, they've been on thin ice for many years now, hence why I rode them, or one of the reasons. And they used to be very extensive, and by very extensive, I mean something like 14 or 15 carriages. You had first and second class sitting cars, as I mentioned earlier, first and second class sleeping carriages. You had a full-size lounge car and a full-size sit-down dining car. Wow, that's an extensive train. That's not something that you see very often on it's always been a commuter train. It was never really a luxury train. That was never its market. I'll mention Spirit of the Outback in a minute. That's a slightly different story. But yeah, I think that rightly so, in 2014, they cut it right back because it was just too much. It was costing them too much to run that extensive of a train for so few passengers. And although I'm sure passenger numbers have dropped because there were some people who were only riding it because it had the beds, and they don't really like the fact that it's an overnight train and it doesn't have beds. Yeah. So yeah, as I mentioned, overnight but no beds. Some people can't deal with that, and that's fine. But many people can deal with that. And although it's labelled as an economy-only train, if you look at the carriage code, it's LAL. And so decoding that means it's an L series steel passenger car. It's saloon seating. So that's the first and the second L. And the A is code for first class. Yet it's labelled economy. There is an LBL car on the Spirit of the Outback, but not on the Westlander and the Inlander, not anymore. Used to be. That was their second class, their economy sitting carriages. They were traditionally LBL, but since the cutback, they've been changed to LAL. So what does that effectively mean to you as a passenger? Well, it means that the seats are much more comfortable. And as somebody who did travel on it overnight, yeah, they were pretty nice. As a day sitting for the times which you set them in the daytime, yeah, very nice. And the lounge car is the half lounge car. I think that's a nice touch because, of course, the other half is for the staff, and yeah, the staff need somewhere to sleep. you could potentially cut back a carriage by removing the power van and adding in head-end power into the locomotives and converting the lounge car section to baggage storage. But since Queensland locomotives tend not to have head-end power, you require a generator carriage, which also serves as your check-in luggage car. So you've got a spare half carriage in the staff car, which, is for passengers and staff to just lounge around. It's nothing fancy. It's just a few seats and some small tables, but it's nice. Do I think such a thing belongs in Victoria? Perhaps overnight to Mildura, that sort of style could work well. Mildura currently doesn't have a passenger service. It used to. Mildura is a bit far to do in a day. It's right on that edge of, if you left very early, you could do it in a day, but it's probably just better to do it overnight, like the Westlander and Inlander. So, I think that's an example that could be translated to other areas of Australia. Worth a mention while I think about it, South Australia does not have any medium or long distance services unless you count the GAN, Indian Pacific and Overland. But the Overland is really the only long distance commuter service. The other two are more luxury services, which I'll touch on in a bit. On the slightly different, I'll say complete opposite actually, on the complete opposite end, you've got the Spirit of Queensland, which is the diesel tilt train from Brisbane to Cairns. That's such a long distance that it has to be overnight, but there will be popular sections of the route which will be done in the daytime. And I say it's very opposite because that service is extremely popular. It was booked out completely when I wanted to travel on it. I've told this story before, but when I went to book it, say about a month or so in advance, I thought that would be enough time, but no. It was booked out completely and I wasn't able to get a seat, but they told me to keep ringing back to check for any cancellations, and sure enough, there was one and I was able to get a seat that way. Now, I travelled on the Spirit of Queensland in economy. Spirit of Queensland was originally planned to replace the Sunlander in both as a route, but also as a service, if you like. So they plan to have the full first and second class seating, first and second class beds, full sit-down lounge and dining car. It's worth mentioning, current Spirit of Queensland, what they've got is they've got economy seating and first class day sitter, first class day seats, which they call it railbed class, which can be converted into a bed for the night. And so I think that works pretty well. Although the railway enthusiast in me is a bit disappointed that it's an open saloon and not a full cabin, I think it's a good compromise in a more modern world. And so, I think the Spirit of Queensland, being a tilt train, it can go faster around corners, and so it cut the journey time significantly from the Sunlander. I think the Spirit of Queensland takes 25 hours and the Sunlander used to take something like 28 or maybe a bit more by the time it ended. I think it was a bit more. I think it was into the 30s. Anyway, and so, yeah, what do I think that does well? And I think the whole train does pretty well. And I think that works well. So you can get some meals delivered to your seat, and if you want any extra meals, you can go to the buffet and buy some more stuff. I think that works well, and I think that the Spirit of Queensland style train could be applied to the Overland and both XPTs. And I'm talking about Sydney to Melbourne and Sydney to Brisbane. I think that's a good example of a big journey on a train that's not super luxurious and out there. It's reasonable, but yeah, serves a good purpose. Now, the final train in Queensland that we'll be talking about is the Spirit of the Outback. Now, this does have the facilities that the Spirit of the Outback has, and keep in mind, it's a primarily tourist luxury sort of orientated train. So you've got a daytime sitting economy, LBL car. You've got an economy lounge / buffet. In fact, I think I'd have to look at the carriage layout diagrams, but I think that the lounge car is separate to the economy lounge car is separate to the buffet car. But anyway, so yeah, the lounge car it looks more like a dining car, to be honest, but it's not a dining car in that you aren't served food at the tables. You're more than welcome to buy food at the buffet and sit down at one of the tables, but it's not a restaurant type thing, if you get what I mean. Then if you go first class on the Spirit of the Outback, you get access to either single or twin beds, and you also get access to a full-size lounge car and a full-sized sit-down dining car. That's a very nice train, and for $400, it's a steal in Australia. I nicknamed it the poor man's GAN because a similar size trip on the GAN, which would be Adelaide to Alice Springs, which is about an overnight trip, 26 hours-ish, that will cost you about $2,000 to get, a bit of outback scenery and a bit of, greenery, and the whole luxury sleeping carriage, dining carriage, lounge carriage, etc. If you want to experience all those things and you're on a budget, do the Spirit of the Outback. $400, a lot cheaper than $2,000. The primary reason for that is subsidies. Of course, the Queensland government subsidises the tickets so that you don't have to pay the full amount, and therefore the ticket is a lot cheaper. If you go on the GAN, it is not subsidised and you've got to pay the full price. And that's also why you'll find that heritage railway tours are more expensive, because government subsidies aren't there. But yeah, the spirit of the outback, can it be applied elsewhere in Australia? Yes and no. It is a luxury train, and there's only a certain market for luxury services. And the LBL carriage at the back is the commuter service on the Spirit of the Outback, because they still want to serve the community. And so, yeah, you'll also find backpackers in the LBL carriage. But yeah, primarily you won't, it's not the extent of the luxuries on the train is unfortunately not really cost effective for the majority of the time. I don't think it really has a place in Victoria. Not really in New South Wales either, because I just don't see a route that's long enough to justify that sort of luxury that, yeah. I was asked about Sydney to Broken Hill being done Spirit of the Outback style. That's the only real iffy one in my mind. If the New South Wales government wanted to promote tourism to that area and they were willing to subsidise such a service, it could definitely be a thing. However, you've got to keep in mind that the Indian Pacific runs along that route, and it is a full luxury train. Yes, it's a lot more expensive, but yeah, that's something you've got to consider. While we're talking about the GAN and the Indian Pacific, until recently, those trains had a sitting carriage strapped on the back. That was a government subsidised carriage. The rest of the train generally wasn't, but they had one carriage at the back with a buffet type service where those trains were still serving the community somewhat. However, in recent years, I guess the respective governments just sort of realised that it wasn't really being used that much, and so they decided to cut it. And I think that's also due to the fact that a lot of the route was already covered by other services, such as the Broken Hill Explorer and the Prospector to Kalgoorlie, from Perth to Kalgoorlie, and the other end of things. So it didn't serve such a purpose anymore. I still think it's a shame. I still wish that there was that, even if you understandably didn't want to subsidise the rest of the train, because, yeah, it's just nice for anyone who's on a budget or anyone who's needing to use the rail. They can go in the sitting carriage. And that's something you've really got to keep in mind if you want to look at cutting a long-distance service as a government. You're cutting access to those communities, and there's going to be some people who will be forced to move closer to Melbourne or whichever major city because the services that they require simply aren't there, simply aren't in their town, and the train isn't there to be able to take them to that appointment or whatever. So, yeah. Mar TV asks, what about the Kuranda Scenic Railway? That's a tourist train, and I'm not counting that as, although yes, it is a timetabled service. It's primarily serving tourists, not commuters. So yeah, it's almost never. It doesn't even have a place for commuters, really. Used to be, but not anymore. That's a common theme of some trains in Australia. The Union Pacific is not marketed to Sydney. Albert says, as Sydney to Broken Hill service. However, it's not even mentioned on the Journey Beyond website as a possible trip on the Union Pacific. It's interesting. But yeah, perhaps there's just not that much of a market for it. I guess it's worth a mention that in Australia at least, we're seeing the rise of these there's very touristy orientated trains, such as the Cruise Express charters. It's been shown that in the past, these sort of things don't tend to last a long time because the market just isn't there for it, or at least it is initially, and then the fad sort of dies out a bit. But yeah, as population grows, there could be a turning point where it becomes really viable. Perhaps this is the turning point. Not really sure. We can analyse that another time. So, yeah, the Indian Pacific and the GAN, because they're not subsidised at all by the governments anymore, they are not commuter services at all. They're not really servicing the communities. It's a pure luxury service. Does it have a place? Of course. I mean, the GAN gets up to like 1 kilometre long. I'm not sure about no other passenger train in the world, but very few others in the world passenger trains get up to 1 kilometre long. So there's obviously a big market there. Journey Beyond Rail makes a lot of money off those trains, and they've done a great job marketing them. All power to them. And with the Great Southern, or whatever it's called, that now is a luxury train, which interestingly runs Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. That's most interesting because from the start, it's not like the GAN and the Indian Pacific, which started out as commuter trains but have evolved into pure luxury. The Great Southern is already covered by commuter trains, the whole route, but the Great Southern is a pure luxury train born out of itself. And so we'll see how long it lasts. It seems to have a market initially, but as I said, luxury long-distance services in Australia tend to have a limited market from past examples. Who knows? It could be different this time. That will be up to Journey Beyond to figure out. Yes, Albert says the Great South Pacific Express from Cairns to Sydney disappeared. Southern Spirit disappeared. Those are the two most notable ones, but there's been many over the years. I think the GAN even ran, in fact, yeah, it did run from Melbourne out of Melbourne at one stage, but they cut it back to Adelaide because the market just wasn't there. So yeah, luxury trains, if that's your goal, go for it. You can get as luxurious as you want, as does Indian Pacific and stuff. I guess I'll just mention, while I think about it, cabin styles for sleeping. In the Gan and Indian Pacific, you can hire out the private carriage and you essentially get your home bedroom but on a train. Takes up a lot of space, very expensive, very few people buy it, hence why there's only one. I'm sure if it was more popular, they'd add a second carriage. But then you've got their platinum class, which is like you've still got a double bed that's not a bunk bed, but the cabin is a bit smaller, still enough room to move around, but, and yeah, it's a decent size, still more expensive than the gold class, but yeah, it certainly wouldn't be viable on any sort of commuter orientated trains. It just takes up, the cabins just take up too much space. Speaking of which, gold class. Now I say that in brackets because as you will be aware if you know your railway history, the GAN and the Indian Pacific used to be run by Commonwealth Railways / Australian National, and they were commuter trains, and so that's where the carriages have all come from essentially, and that sort of size cabin is fairly standard throughout Australia as a sleeping carriage size. Is it gold? Well, that's up to you to decide, I guess, but by my definition, it's a bit overrated to call it gold class. To me, gold indicates something super luxurious, but hey, you know what? Great Eastern Rail does a good job at marketing it, and they sell out gold class, so good on them. In gold class, you've got the choice of, I was going to say you've got single and twinette, but I'm not sure if Platinum has single beds. I know they've got twin single, but I'm not sure if they've got just plain single. Anyway, in Platinum. In gold class, and this is pretty standard across any sort of other sleeping trains throughout Australia, is in the twinette, you've probably got a corridor down the side of the carriage and compartments that have a bunk bed, and you've got the bunk beds on the one half of your cabin and then open space on the other half, and you'll also get a couple of dressers, maybe if you're lucky an ensuite. That can be good. In the single bed cabins, and you'll obviously have the beds fold up and convert into a seat for the daytime. For the single bed rooms, which are generally referred to as roomettes, you will find that they have a single seat which can fold down into a bed. When it's in the seating configuration, you've got a decent, an alright amount of room. It's not huge. It's certainly not twinette big, but it's all right. It's certainly a lot more room than you'd get in a saloon-style, open saloon-style sitting carriage. When the bed is down, however, you've almost got enough space to stand and turn around, but that's about it. There's not much space at all, and you've got a centre corridor that generally zigzags. I believe that Victoria/New South Wales, with the Southern Spirit, Southern Aurora, was the first train in Australia to introduce the zigzag type corridor and I believe we've exported that idea internationally. Could be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Previously, you just have sort of a straight centre corridor. The advantage of the zigzag corridor is that you tend to get a little bit more usable space in the roomette rooms when the bed is down. Whereas in the centre corridor style, which you saw on the overland style carriages, and Vinelander for that matter, if you're in a roomette and the bed is down and it's just a straight centre corridor, you've got almost no room. So yeah, that is fairly typical. What we don't see anymore in Australia is the Queensland economy second class, which I believe was a triple bunk side corridor type thing, and you shared a room with strangers. Some people are not comfortable with that idea, sleeping in the same room as strangers, but hey, some people paid for it. And it's really not that uncommon internationally. But yeah, we don't see it anymore. According to this Queensland Rail Travel website, the Spirit of the Outback should still have economy sleepers, but they are withdrawn for refurbishment. Whether we'll actually see them return or not, I don't know. I suspect not. Overseas, you can find up to 6 beds, 6 bunks to a cabin. So anything beyond 2 people double bunk in a room is generally called a couchette. And yeah, so we never saw anything beyond 3 in Australia, I'm pretty sure. But internationally, you can see up to 6 people on trains such as the Trans-Siberian in 3rd class. They're generally pretty packed, and you're going to be sharing with strangers, but if you want a cheap bed, it's certainly an option. And if I was travelling internationally, I'd certainly consider it. Yeah, economy class, I think, really doesn't need a lounge. That can be something that's reserved for 1st class. But hey, if you want to provide one, that's nice. Same with dining cars. We're running quite over time, but one final sort of mention is the old rail motors of Victoria. Now, this was common throughout Australia and I believe internationally as well, but the rail motor services, because they're not a big train, and the big trains did this to some extent, but it was more common for a rail motor service to do this. they're often quite a long service, which means that you'd have to stop for food, but there's not enough space on board to provide cooking facilities for even a sort of light meal. So they generally stopped at stations along the way, and there was a dining room at the station, and that's where you'd have your meal. You'd get back on the train, it'd go off again. Certainly in Australia, there are no, I mean, there's a few dining rooms that are still operating around, but not in conjunction with the service. Not so much so that you can come in on the train, have a meal in the dining room, get back on the same train and continue on your service. I would say the New South Wales mail trains did that for food/drinks. Yes. And there were a few trains in Victoria that did it. Generally in the olden days, call it sort of 60s, 70s and earlier, you would have the Premier Express service, which would have the dining car on board, and then you'd have the relief service or mail service type thing, and that would stop at stations for meals. Why we don't see dining cars and that sort of thing on trains anymore, the primary reason is economics. It just doesn't make financial sense to put it on, even though, yes, long distance rail, unless it's a luxury service, is never going to make a profit. That's not its purpose. You still have to pay attention to economics. You've got to have a limit to how much you subsidise it. But trains, back in the day where you'd have the relief services not using, the express services using the dining cars and the relief services not so much using the dining cars, the trains were arranged with carriages. They generally weren't kept in so much sets of carriages, whereas now pretty much all our passenger trains in Australia, at least, are block trains, so that you will there won't be rearranging of carriages, and again, if you are looking at putting on a dining car, that's going to be a permanent thing for that block. You can't retire it for part of the day like you used to, and use the rest of the carriages. So again, economics, it all sort of ties in. Is there anything else that I wish to mention? G'day, Brian. You've joined in right at the end of it. I have a feeling there was something, but I've forgotten. I guess I'll just say that economics will play more and more of a part in trains going forward, long distance rail especially, and you're never going to beat planes. You just aren't. Oh, that's right. I was going to mention bullet trains. Bullet trains. Some people are calling for a bullet train between Melbourne and Sydney. It's been proposed for a long time. I think every federal government since like the 1960s has proposed one. The population just isn't there, is the short answer from my end. if you did put a bullet train in, the population would likely increase to wherever it stopped along the way. But yeah, you've just got to keep in mind that, again, you won't beat planes, not without a significant cost. You won't beat them in speed. So you can get comparable to planes, but not much faster. For Melbourne to Sydney, which would be the only place in Australia where it would even be remotely possible or feasible, I should say, yeah, the planes, I think planes just serve us well enough. It would be much better to get an airport train up and running for Melbourne, and you've already got one in Sydney. So, yeah, and I mean, the Skybus does a reasonable job in the meantime. So, short answer, bullet trains, not for Australia, not yet at least. Yes, they work well overseas, but overseas is a lot higher population density than Australia. All right then, that's all that I'm going to talk about for tonight. We've gone like 22 minutes overtime, but there was a lot to discuss, and I hope I've given you stuff to think about. Opinions are always welcome. These are, of course, my own. And yeah, I've appreciated everyone tuning in and all the talking points and examples that have been made. So thanks everyone for watching. Oh, one last thing which is not topic related, but hey, you've stuck this far, so hey, why not watch another minute or two? This Sunday, I might have a video out, a proper video. It'll be my Urbex New Year's Eve extravaganza. It's like 7 or 8 months overdue. Not quite 8, but 6 or 7, I guess. It might come out on Sunday, it might not. I've got it mostly finished. I've got the rough cut done, but I need to go through it and figure out music and voiceovers. That's going to be my job tomorrow. We'll see how it goes. If it's not Sunday, I'll try and get it out for like Monday or Tuesday or something. Very latest next Sunday, but it probably won't stretch out that far. But yeah, I will be returning to regular uploads, hopefully. So, exciting times ahead. Brian asked for the link to the map I made. I will just briefly give you that, and then I'll end off the stream. That should work. All right. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. See you in 2 weeks for another live stream. Topic announced on the day. Bye-bye.